All right. So this was under the feature topics, and is this Ian?
Yeah.
All right. Well, go ahead.
This was just in response to Lynn's topic from last week of getting ambient mesh to beta. I just wanted to sort of take the temperature of the community early on whether we would tolerate having like release candidate forks or forked crates in ztunnel at beta. And if that's okay, then we don't need to track it. But if that's something that folks feel strongly about, then we should probably track it.
I think it's definitely not great. But if the hyper doesn't release 1.0, then I don't want to take a hard dependency on someone else if they're slow. They were supposed to be 1.0 at this point, so they're kind of falling behind. I mean, we could aid in that effort if someone is willing to invest time in helping out upstream get to 1.0. So I would say I would love for it to not happen, but I don't know that it's necessarily a hard blocker to me. We should probably caveat when we launch beta that ambient beta is not the same thing as virtual service being beta or something along those lines, right? They're very fundamentally different.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. The intent was really just so that nobody was surprised by this in like the last weeks before we were trying to go to beta. Just make sure everyone's aware so they can speak up if they feel strongly.
Yeah, one thing that is a little bit concerning is we do say for beta, the security policy is anything will be disclosed and patched, which I don't know that Hyper has the same policy on their 1.0 branch. Also says safety for production use. I don't know if they really claim that for Hyper 1.0 yet. I'm guessing they'll make progress by the time we go beta, but it's hard to say.
Yeah, that would certainly be nice. Like you said, their intent was to be 1.0 already, so.
This is what happens when people don't contribute to upstream. Any one of us on this call could go fix this by dedicating time to work on Hyper. They don't have hard problems to solve. They just need people.
Do you have some idea what's in the backlog?
It's all like migration type work, like upgrade guides, deprecating things, adding like they're doing like some shims to make transition easier. So they're like backporting some of the 1.0 stuff into the old branch so that you can kind of do a smoother upgrade, things like that. They have a big like GitHub board and stuff that they're trying to get traction on. As far as I know, it's just like kind of things that anyone could do.
Yeah, I think John's right. A lot of the stuff they've said, like we're hoping for contributions, and if it's something that we see value in, you know, as the Istio community, then I think John's right. We can look to make those contributions. We're developing that Rust expertise in the community.
Any other comments on this topic? All right, sounds like that's a no. Does anyone else in the community have things to discuss? Keith?
Yeah, I have to have a quick question around the, this goes back to Lynn's Strive Ambient mesh to beta doc. I'd like to do some stuff to help out with the APIs part of it. I know that we did some discussion last week on authorization policy and the direction there, but the call to action for the API section of that doc refers to another doc called Ambient API. So I know John and Lynn worked on at one point. There's a lot of information in that doc, and it's really difficult to tell what is, what has consensus, what's done, etc. Is there any hope of that doc being updated and being cleaned up, or should I just start pulling things out of that doc into separate docs for review? For example, I could take the information for authorization policy and put that in a separate doc. Do you think that would help things move quicker? Because I'm just trying to figure out where the work needs to happen.
I'm somewhat worried about splitting out the doc because they're all kind of coupled. Like, say we're doing parent ref on authorization policy, we ought to do it on request authentication, for example. But certainly contributions to the doc would be helpful. I did say I was going to go clean it up a bit, and then I didn't do it. I think others said that they were going to review it, and there's no comments. So we definitely need some more attention on it. But I'm not sure that new docs is the solution necessarily.
One thing that may be useful is to start a samples directory or test directory and put everything that is supported in Ambient in YAML files that are maybe easier to understand and kind of, so we kind of have a visual effect and kind of we can even test that the particular configurations exist, and because there are not so many of the APIs, I think. I mean, it's kind of it will be useful also for the users.
Okay, so I will go. There are lots of old comments on the doc, on the Ambient API stock specifically. I will link that in the meeting notes just so everyone knows what I'm talking about. There are a lot of old comments, but I can create some new ones on the stuff that I'm looking to try to tackle, and hopefully we can sort it out from there.
John, do you think it would make sense to do schedule a walkthrough of the doc for anyone who wanted to participate? Like you said, there's a lot in there.
Yeah.
It would be hard to cover it in this meeting.
Yeah, we could do that. That sounds good. We don't actually have that much on the agenda, so we potentially could do it in this meeting if nothing else comes up.
We could try to do some of it.
Yeah.
That might be, yeah.
So shall we? We have 45 minutes.
Was there any hidden agenda items anyone want to discuss, or if not, I say we go for it.
Yeah, the only other thing I can think of is the baggage discussion.
Oh yeah, is Squat here? Yes.
Here.
Yeah, we could do that.
That one is also somewhat pressing, I guess. Well,
and related to the API. Related to the API in the sense that probably we should also consider the protocol, and probably it's even higher priority to have a clear definition of what is a protocol.
Okay. Claude, do you want to take a second to summarize what baggage is, why it is, what the problems with it are, and what the options are? Or like I or John or someone else can do that. Yeah, and there's a tracking GitHub issue with all the content.
Yeah, so the baggage header is a new header that we decided to use in Ambient as part of connect requests that replaces the basically client metadata in terms of workload metadata. I think it has things like pod deployment, pod labels, and so on. And the purpose is to provide telemetry at the destination about the source.
Right.
Similarly, you can provide telemetry about destination at the source, but that's not as pressing as telemetry about source at destination.
And so there are two ways to exchange this information, right? Because we need this information to produce useful telemetry, logging, so on and so forth, right? One is to send this information around in the data path. And the second option is to look it up from some central authority and not pass around in the data path.
Right.
And there's a hybrid between those two. That there are various options.
That's right. And the problem that I was basically trying to argue about is that we are in the case where we send all telemetry and baggage, and it's highly restrictive. Because what it does, it requires our protocol to be dependent on the type of telemetry we can possibly emit. That means, for example, if a client wants to participate in this protocol, it has to provide telemetry. Similarly, it has to implement telemetry ingestion.
And so the hybrid. Oh, go ahead, Dustin.
No, I want to say it's not exclusive. So I think there are a lot of discussion about telemetry where we are asked to pick a choice, but telemetry is kind of fluid. It's if the peer is sending baggage, we obviously should honor it and take information from the baggage. If the client is not an Istio client, is not sending baggage, what can we do? I mean, we should definitely have some way to look up telemetry through something.
Yeah, right. That's
There's
exactly
not
the point.
either or, it's both. And if we have telemetry in the certificate,
right.
Yeah.
That's the problem,
So
is that right now it's not either or. It's basically only ways to send baggage.
Yeah. Okay. So we have the hybrid, which is if it's the data path, use it. If it's not, look it up from an authority. Data path. Well, we don't have it, right? We're trying to choose our options here.
Yep.
And I generally agree with Costin about the approach of use it if the data path gives it, otherwise look it up from an authority. There are obviously complications. Like let's say you have a data path that spans multiple clusters or networks, right? And your local authority for resolving telemetry, if it's not provided in the data path, doesn't see a lot of information about the origin, then the amount of telemetry that you get is restricted, right? It's restricted to what's in the certificate handshake, right? So there's a tiering of fidelity of information about peers in the exchange, where the minimum guaranteed amount is, well, if they're participating in an MTLS handshake, the minimum amount is in the client, the peer presented certificate. If they're not doing MTLS, it's nothing. It's what you can look up based on the IP, which who knows, right? So there are these tiers of fidelity. Right, and so, a given metadata server not having the source of truth for the entire network is probably an expected and reasonable outcome, but just because it can be really hard to federate all that information right across really large distributed systems. But there are ways we could maybe go about making that better. But anyway, so there are two tracks that need to evolve.
Yeah, I just wanted to add some detail. I mean, the reason why this work was motivated is because we already ignore baggage in the mesh at Ambient Z tunnels because we trust IPs. So we send baggage, but we don't use it. So there's precedent for that already. And I think we also need better controls about between networks and clusters. I agree about that, and it should be something that is more, not on and off. It has to be about which destination it's going to, because I think there's also a requirement to not send the baggage to destinations that don't need them. And to have this fine-grained controls, we need a solution that basically doesn't require baggage in general and only uses it sometimes.
Ask when you don't want to send baggage.
When you don't have overhead associated with baggage.
Okay, so it's for performance.
That, and also because you can not send baggage. Right.
I don't
Okay,
think.
so we
We
have a variety of options for how to exchange baggage. Maybe we should go through those. Discuss the relative pros and cons. Right. Today we put it in the header of every HTTP connect, right? When we do HBO. That's
yes.
one option. Another option is to do it based on a well-known API defined between the Z tunnels that exists within the connection tunnel. Right, so decouple it from connect, right, and couple it to the existence of an MTLS handshake connection. Right, so we create an API.
Yeah, I think this whole proposal about doing the metadata exchange is probably far more important in waypoints and gateways, where you have a lot of short HTTP requests. I mean, I don't think the overhead of baggage in Connect is a big deal, and Connect probably is going to be used by Z-tunnel. I mean, it's probably lower priorities than solving the problem for the high, short deep requests in. And if we have an implementation of the metadata exchange, probably we can just use it because it's probably the most useful, since it works with non-Istio workloads and it's lower overhead and simpler. And drop the baggage until we have a more concrete use for it. What do you think, Louis?
So in Z-tunnel today, we said we're not using it.
So we use both. We do what Costin said, basically. We prefer the metadata, and then we fall back to baggage. The one issue with that, though, is that it doesn't work with multi-network, because we don't know if the request is from our network or not. So we get some IP address and we look it up, but who knows?
We may not know.
Yeah,
No.
we may just we may say, it knows what this IP address is, and it returns a bunch of bogus.
But John, it is not bogus ever. I mean, it's always either something that your pilot knows about because it's in your network. You cannot have a request go between pod A and pod B in two different networks directly. Either they are in the same flat network or they are not. If they are not, it goes through the east-west.
Yeah, but I don't want the east-west to be I don't want the metadata of the east-west gateway. I want the metadata of the original.
True, but in Istio, we watch even the remote networks. So we probably, we'll need to pass.
But we don't even know. Well, two things. One, we don't even know that it should be in the other network that we should look up, because we just get the IP. So we could fix that, but then we have to have the client tell us what network they're in. We also have to have them tell us what their IP address is in the client request, because it's tunneled through. The other thing that, as far as what Lou was going to say, is that there's split brain potentially. So
yes, right. Like we can still communicate with networks where we don't actually know the endpoints within them, Custom.
No, I completely agree. But my point is, for this case, we have X forwarded clients at XFF, forwarded, and there are plenty of prior art and existing practices for this. If you go through a gateway, so what do I mean?
Yeah, no. So I think the only question right now is we need some signaling mechanism from the control plane to the data plane to tell it to use baggage in certain cases, right? What are those cases today, right? So we say that for a given endpoint that we're trying to reach or a gateway, we have to tell Z-tunnel whether to emit baggage or not, right? It's pretty simple, right? What the constraint is, right? Z-tunnel is supposed to be pretty homuncular, right? It's just like it does what it's told. So is this just a feature of the XDS API for programming the Z-tunnel to say, look, when you talk to this thing, emit baggage or don't emit baggage. Is that as far as we want to go for the moment?
I would restrict it a bit, Louis, to say that who should emit this baggage. Maybe it's only for multi-network cases. I don't want to kind of, so if it has to go through a multi-network, maybe we can, since we know you need to forward to the special gateway, that's when we would turn this kind of stuff, and only if we don't have some form of federation and visibility.
Right, but that's already a signal in the control plane API custom, right? Because you say, look, only do it when you go through an east-west gateway. Well, the east-west gateway exists in the control plane API, right?
Yeah,
so it's
that's
kind of the
reasonable.
same thing.
Yeah.
Why not just always send it? Like, I mean, we've said performance. I mean, we should test it before we make decisions. I'm skeptical that it is relevant given the overhead of a connection. Adding one header for a connection seems pretty low. Go ahead, Claude.
Because if you always send it, it becomes a de facto part of the protocol. And that's sort of the undesired outcome, because now every client has to emit it.
Well, they
Almost
don't.
ready.
I don't know. I see what you mean, but in the other sense, like otherwise the client has to guess whether the server is going to know who it is without it. It's like I'm not saying we should only use baggage. I'm saying baggage should always be the fallback, but I'm not sure why clients shouldn't always be nice and send it.
Because then you restrict the type of clients. Now every client who wants to speak the protocol has to produce telemetry, and that's
no, they
that's
don't
not
have
always
to,
possible.
right? They can send, if they choose to not send it, the server may not get telemetry. They may not be happy about that. But in many cases, they can probably look it up from metadata server. Like, I'm not sure how not sending the baggage makes it better that clients don't send the baggage. The end result's the same. We don't have the baggage, right? We already know that we cannot rely only on metadata lookup for split brain cases, right? So it feels like we're saying sometimes there may be no baggage, so we should never send baggage.
So do we have a, right, so the concrete answer would be performance, right? Like it's too expensive to do it. But right now we don't have any evidence that it's actually concretely too expensive. So I kind of agree with John, but unless we have evidence that it's a real performance overhead, we should probably send it. Now, we could have a debate about the how we send it right now. Right, and obviously there are interoperability issues with the various options.
Yeah, we have a lot of evidence why people don't want it. I mean, from sidecars, lots of clients want to remove the peer metadata baggage. It's at least 8 kilobytes. The requests are smaller than 4 kilobytes sometimes. It's like doubling or tripling the size.
Okay, which that's fair.
I don't think it's fair. I don't think they're equivalent. Because one is tied to an HTTP request, which is cheap, and the other is tied to a connection, which is expensive. And we're not sending 8 kilobytes in baggage, right? It's a much smaller set, which maybe means that we're not putting enough in baggage, which maybe is another problem. But at least right now, we're only setting, I think, 4 attributes.
Well, in the case you have a client that opens a connection per request, like Python, it is the same thing, right?
It is, but how much? What is the overhead of them doing that connection? It's probably 50 milliseconds per connection. So then, what is the overhead of the baggage header in comparison to the overhead of the connection? It's much smaller than.
It's not about latency, it's about the sizes. It really trips people off because they don't really like seeing extra bandwidth. I mean, there's a cost associated with parsing, and CPU cost associated with trying to drop it. Even in sidecars, we cache this processing because it would take up to 20% of envoy time just to parse this header.
Yeah, but it's kind of apples to oranges, right? That was not baggage. That was proto buffer, flat buffer, whatever we end up using. Right? It's
okay. So it's what it seems like here is that we actually need an evolvable mechanism for describing how we want to exchange baggage, because like there are lots of different ways to do the exchange in the data path. Right, like once per request, once per TCP connection, once per tunnel, right? Once per pre-negotiated IP, right? Because right, and they all depend on the originator knowing some information about the destination to choose the optimal baggage exchange mechanism, right?
I'm less worried about performance and worried about interop and insularity of defining yet another not invented here protocol and system. For multi-network case, which is only case where baggage may make sense, maybe we should take a look at the existing standards and not use baggage for this particular. I mean, what you propose, Louis, with sign jot and other things may be very valid. Federation, it's something also we want to explore, but at least for single network, do we have any reason to keep using baggage?
So I think, right, basically we have an array of baggage exchange mechanisms that needs to evolve based over time. And we have two maybe that we want to support initially, right? One, which is we send it all the time in HTTP Connect as a header. And the other is we don't send it and you're expected to get it from the metadata server. And then if we need a third one, because people are complaining or the performance overhead of sending in Connect all the time is too much, then we need to add another one, right? So we need an evolvable mechanism, right? And that has to exist in the control plane API, right?
Or
I want to be choice about that part.
So, Carsten, your proposal is that in multi-network we always use baggage, and in single network we never use baggage, right? If so, I think
entirely, not always. I mean, it's in multi-network. If you have split brain, or I mean, I think the idea of how to find metadata about a peer on the internet in general is a general problem. It's a very complicated one, and it has some solutions. I mean, typically you do PTR, you do geolocations. There are all kind of solutions in place to get metadata about your peer on the internet, and they're broadly used. They're not perfect, of course. We are probably in the same situation. I mean, either we are centralized and EastUOD can know the EastUOD from the other network, can get metadata, and you have a discovery server that is across the mesh, and then we have no problem. Or we are in this kind of split brain, uncooperating, federated, untrusted. They don't trust each other, and we need what Louis said initially. I mean, some jot and some more integration. What baggage from boundaries is probably the right solution, but not necessarily our baggage. We need to look up for more, how metadata is derived on the wild internet if we are in this situation.
I would be fine with the use baggage only for cross network. I think that solves in my mind, it solves a lot of concerns that was brought up, but I'll have to let them answer. But in terms of performance, the overhead of crossing a network is already much larger. So adding a little bit more on that doesn't seem terrible. And the other concern, I think, was that clients it raises the bar for clients, but the bar to do multi-network as a client is also higher than normal communication. So, I mean, in some sense, it's like these two things are already bad, so why not make it a little bit worse? But it's reasonable. So I wouldn't mind that approach. One thing I will say is we had previously said we would trust metadata server over baggage. I think in order to do this, we would probably always trust baggage if it's there. Otherwise, we need a way for the client to tell us what network they're from, which is a little wonky, because otherwise we may incorrectly look something up. But otherwise, I think it makes sense, personally.
Yeah, the baggage is inside a handshake that's being performed with a peer, right? So we trust its identity up to all the policy limits. What metadata it asserts about itself in that flow, we could sign it or not sign it, right? Like we have the options. So the only thing I'm a little bit wary about is being prescriptive about the boundary definition, like same network or not same network, same cluster or not same cluster. I think we want to be control planes may vary, right, in how they make that interpretation, and I think we want to allow for that variation. And the way to do that is still to put this into the API.
Do you have any concrete examples? Like in my mind, it's not actually necessarily a network or a cluster, but more when you're crossing through what in the API we call the network gateway is when I would do it. Is there cases where you'd want something different?
So let's say you have two very large clusters on the same network, right? And you don't want to replicate endpoint discovery between them, right? So, right, each SDOD is only reading its local cluster, right? And then I use service entry to expose an endpoint in the other network. In the other cluster, it's still in the same network, right? So it's not about the network boundary anymore.
But how do you get there? Are you going through a load balancer?
Nope. I could go direct.
How do you go direct if you don't know about the other side?
Because I use service entry to declare it, right? Like service entry is a publishing API.
But you don't know the endpoints of it?
No, I do. I put the endpoints in, right? So they're on the same network, but they're not in the same cluster. And the SDOD that I wrote it to is not watching the other cluster, right? So it doesn't.
So the client knows the server's endpoints, but the server doesn't know the client's.
Yes.
Okay. So it's one-way knowledge.
Yeah.
I see.
Right. So it's not clearly it's not the network boundary. It's in that example, it's a cluster boundary. Right. And it could be asymmetric.
One of the discussions on the side channel was about IPs as not very good identities and so forth. And now we are discussing telemetry and cross namespace and cross network with overlapping IPs and all that. Should we consider putting the host name, the fully qualified host name, with some mechanism to identify clusters always in the request? Is different from baggage. I mean, it's not about arbitrary telemetry. It's that universally unique and kind of fully qualified identity of each peer, from which you can look up and do other things.
So there's a discussion in the XDS design doc about what the identity should be for resources within the model, right? And that what you just described, Costin, has to align with that.
Yes, probably there as well. But again, there are multiple identities. We use IP for some things. We use host names. We use PV certificates. I mean, it's normal for something to have multiple identities. But from a protocol level, I mean, since we're discussing what should be in the headers or not.
Well, what would the receiver do with that information?
Log it, use it to look up. Normally, the protocol, I mean, when you do connect, you have fully qualified host name, not IPs, as we use. We had some discussion before with John. I don't think we reached a conclusion or agreed, but it's clear that when you do connect, many systems use fully qualified host names, not IPs as authority or part of the payload. Outside of Istio, I mean, our implementation is using IPs, but. So as a middle ground, basically having just the fully qualified domain name of each peer. That's instead of IP plus network.
Right, but that you don't guarantee non-collision. But you can't guarantee non-collision for that.
Fully qualified host names, kind of by definition, guarantee no collision. I mean, the way they are defined is that the.
So the example I just gave, right? Where the clusters were independent, they could talk because they were part of the same identity domain. They were on the same network. They had asymmetric knowledge of each other. How do you guarantee that their identities don't collide? What identity would you use?
Yes, that's an important part of what I'm talking. We need some way to name the clusters, as instead of in cluster local everywhere, to give user a way to each cluster has a name in our system that is unique because how multi-cluster is implemented, and so basically each of them will get its own suffix. If you look at there is a now GKE feature to have VPC wide DNS, where again each cluster is named, and then you get a really unique fully qualified domain name.
Right, and the assumption is that those would be unique within the trust domain that is aligned with the certificate issuance boundary.
Which is normal, in a way. I mean, it's also a useful feature.
Yeah, no, that's typical. It's like, I don't think, one, people aren't doing that today. So we're gonna have to wait for that. Two, right now, your only dependency was log, right? So it's not a functional interaction depending, right? It's an interoperability thing.
Yes, this can be integrated with DNS, proper DNS, but I think we are kind of doing it for users because remember, the cluster name is actually part of internal Istio implementation. We always have inject the cluster, we always pass the cluster. It's using authentication because that's how we validate the JOT token. So the actual, we have a cluster name that is, the secret, the part of the secret that is driving multi-cluster. It's not exposed to the user. Yes.
Well, that's in the typical multi-cluster case, right? With one control plane watching multiple clusters. We have the archipelago model, right? With loosely coupled clusters not doing that. That still has to function.
Yeah, but that's where you probably want it the most because having cluster local and archipelago are kind of weird.
Well, the only thing that unifies those, right, is the trust domain issuance mechanism.
Yeah, but DNS also, how do you refer? I mean, if you talk from A to B, from island A to island B, you need some way as a client to indicate where you want to communicate. That's a DNS name.
Right, that's what's service entry and split horizon does.
Yeah. But even with service entry, there is some DNS, the whole DNS capture or whatever, because at the end of the day, the application is still using a fully qualified domain name when they do curl.
I don't think we're going to be able to guarantee uniqueness in the short term.
Well,
right, so it's going to make it hard to universally adopt that. Like we can have a preferred name, like we can say we prefer to use an FQDN when we address something, if we have the option to do it, but we may not know it, right? We may just have the bare IP, and that's what we would have to send.
Yes, there is a case where you only have the IP, but even with service entry and split horizon or whatever, in service entry you still put a host name, and the HTTP request made by the actual application, it's still a fully qualified domain name.
Right, but that's
it's split
the
horizon.
name, right? It's split horizon, right? So that name may not make any sense on the receiving side.
Yeah, I think those cases, should expect some telemetry inconsistency.
Well, baggage still allows us to have consistent telemetry, right? Like, as long as we can say we need baggage to be exchanged in these situations, right? That's why I'm arguing for having this be a feature of the control plane, because then we can choose, right? The control plane can make that decision.
How would you make that decision, though? Like, I get we can stick it in XDS. I'm just not sure how we would decide what to put there. If you don't know about the destination, how do you know whether they know about you? I guess the question.
So the simple one would be, right, if we can perform a reverse on the IP with the control plane, and the control plane knows about it, then you can make that inference to not use baggage, right? Because the control plane is watching it.
But you were talking about the asymmetric use case, right? So
right, so that's a situation.
They know everything, and then.
But in that situation, the control plane doesn't actually know, because service entry it's not watching the IP. It's just told there's an IP, right? It doesn't know anything about the endpoint.
I bet you could even without service entries, you could have one cluster that's watching all endpoints doing standard multi-cluster.
Sure.
But then the other cluster is only watching its own local cluster, right? And in that case,
right.
We would need to send a baggage, but I'm not sure how we would know that.
So does who initiated the connection suffice?
So the server will know it needs baggage because it won't know who it is. But then at that point, they can't tell the client that they should have sent the baggage, right? There's no like in theory, you could do like some sort of negotiation or something, or have the server ask out of band, like, I need the baggage for this identity or something. But then we get into a new protocol for baggage rather than just the header.
Please no other ALPN.
Yeah, I don't want to do those. Those were listed as alternative bad ideas. So, like it seems like only the server knows whether they need baggage or not, but it's the client who decides to send it.
No, I think it's always the client who knows that it needs to send, because client will need to be told to talk with a waypoint, with a egress east-west gateway.
Well, in that
No,
case,
so
it's fine, but this is for the asymmetric knowledge, which is pretty niche, I think. But
What will be in this case? I mean, where will be asymmetric unless you
like in
don't
theory,
know?
you could have the client cluster is fully connected, and then the server cluster is not connected at all, right?
That's something we should not even support, I think.
Yeah, I mean, we could just say baggage won't work in this case, but I thought that's what Louis said. We want to have an explicit API to support. So
right, so it's easy to set up a split brain situation, right? Like the question is, what do we have to do? We can let it just fall into the degraded mode of, look, the only information you have is what's in the cert, right? So you have limited baggage, and then your telemetry system has to adapt to limited baggage, such as it is. And we can try and address making limited baggage have better fidelity by putting more stuff into the cert, right? Which has its appeal, like, because it's verified, it's signed, right? ... And you know, it's not like certs aren't already fat, and they're exchanged. Like, cert is the logical place for all of this to go, right? It's a unified identity domain. It's exchanged once by each peer in the flow, right? It has the right lifecycle semantics. Identity shouldn't be switching unless the cert is actually rotated, right? Like, it has all the right properties. The problem is, how do you put it in there? Right, and standardizing that with a bunch of different CAs that may or may not want to do it, but right, that's it, right? Everything else is a workaround to the fact that we can't put it in the cert or we can't put it in efficiently. And yes, like there's just these standardization problems, as Ben said, which we could look at it. I'm not sure, Ben, right, all of the out-of-band or hand baggage mechanisms also don't establish, well,
Yeah,
they're as bad with possession
yeah.
anyway. So
Sure. Yeah, I don't know if possession is on the table, but that's kind of what I was like, maybe identity is a separate line item really from baggage, and baggage, you know. I don't know.
Oh yeah, no, baggage is never for identity. Like,
Yeah.
no authorization policy should be ever written against something with baggage.
Yes.
Unless it's trusted, right? And
that
that means
requires
signed.
Yeah, signed or something similar to signing in terms of trustability. Yeah.
So my preference would be to find some way to put it into the cert in almost all cases, right? The only question is, do we think we can actually do that, and what standards, right, apply?
And if cert will even be available, because if encryption is pushed deeper, I don't know how much of the cert will get and how we'll get it.
But then we need some other way to recover, right, what is in the cert, right, custom. Like, let's say encryption got pushed down into the physical network with whatever properties we wanted, like, which right now is not happening.
Yes, a nice property of what is proposing with metadata service. I mean, asking the trust discovery server is that it kind of avoids this problem as well, because if you know that it was verified and that the peer is
that doesn't change the basic property of, if it's in the data plane, use it. If it's not, get it from the metadata server.
Yeah, I agree.
But exchanging it in certs in the network is still get it from the data plane, right? Right, we're just arguing about the mechanism. Okay, so we have, and then, all right, so we still have those core principles, right? Like, we have limited baggage and extended, and we're not really sure exactly what limited is, but today we're saying it's what we already put into the cert. And there's extended, which we may or may not put in the cert, we may or may not exchange via header, but we're putting it in the data plane. And then we have a choice to make about whether to do that or not. And then whether the control plane controls that or not, based on some scenarios. Or whether it's implicit in the control plane API or explicit. And the argument I was making about making it explicit was so that we could evolve it, even if we don't know exactly how we want the control plane to make this decision right now, based on what criteria or what knowledge. Separate from the mechanism, right? Like it's clear we have mechanism decisions to look at.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's a pretty complicated problem in the most general case, but for the to get started and for the initial stuff, since I don't think we support multi-network right now, I think we can make some progress with the simplified.
Okay, so we need to define what it means to have limited or no baggage, right? Semantically, right? What should happen? Right, because no matter what we do, we'll probably end up in that situation. Then we need to work on the mechanism, and then we need to figure out how we want to express to the data plane what it should do. And we can deal with each of those three separately. And it's okay if we have the limited baggage stuff nailed down. If the other two parts aren't working perfectly, at least we know what the behavior of the system is supposed to be like. And users aren't left completely in the dark about who's talking to who.
So if I'm reading correctly, we have some more or less agreements that some form of metadata lookup will be implemented and deployed. Do you want to do it also for all sidecars, or do you want it to be ambient specific? I mean, gateways, waypoints, egress, so forth.
If we can settle out reasonable answers to the other three, the three parts, and when we test it, it provides good coverage for typical scenarios, then yeah, I think it's reasonable to take it and use it elsewhere.
I think it will also improve the situation for Istio and when working with non-Istio workloads, because that will give us telemetry even if you talk with a non-Istio workload. That's I think a big benefit.
John, what? Does that sound like a reasonable? There's a three-pronged approach.
Yeah, I think my biggest open question is like how we're actually going to program this. I'm not hugely in favor of putting things in the XDS API that have no clear configuration for them. But in general, I think I'm on the same page.
Is it different from the workload discovery service that we have?
No. So I think it's saying we're going to put it in the workload discovery service because you have to. That's the thing that's going to tell the data plane what to do. I think John is objecting to we don't know exactly what we want to say yet. So we know we want an API, we just don't know what that API says.
Okay.
And basically, like we should figure out what we need to program. Like it doesn't help to have knobs on the Z10 if we don't set the knobs, right? So
right,
we need to figure out when we're going to set the knobs, and then we can know what knobs to set in.
Yeah, I think that's fair. So like I think we know that we need an API. We don't know what that API needs to be exactly yet. Right. So we have this kind of like placeholder thing that we want to do.
But the workload discovery service can provide. I mean, if you add labels to the workload discovery service, it
yeah, no. It's just
okay.
like it's in that API somewhere, custom.
Okay.
It's just what does it look like?
Yeah, I don't want the proliferation of APIs. That's what I'm trying to avoid.
Yeah, so it's a field in some of those resources inside that API.
Okay, perfect.
So what about the mechanism? Go ahead, question.
Yeah, so for the API for this discovery, I would actually think that might need a larger scope than just zTunnel, because ultimately it would be better value if OpenTelemetry and gRPC and all other XDS clients could implement the same discovery mechanism. So I think it's not just restricted to the Ambient use case. I don't know if you can have one API that has everything because otherwise we're limiting ourselves to just ztunnel.
Right. So, I mean, we did call it the workload discovery API for a reason, right? Obviously, it has to meet the needs of ztunnel for routing. Does that mean that it is unsuitable for those other use cases, even if they just use it in a more limited fashion?
I think it would be weird if OpenTelemetry collectors have, listens to workload discovery routing, because it's just somewhat unusual. But also the schema might need to be, adjusted depending on what we agree together. Might need to use, OpenTelemetry names for certain fields because that's the standard.
Right. I mean, right now, what we did in the workload discovery API is we put workload metadata into its own message, right? So that it could somewhat evolve separately, and including the nomenclature, right? So we should be able to bring that message and the OTel requirements into alignment. So maybe you want to go and propose some updates to that. At least that brings that part of the schema into alignment, even if the outer structure is not ideal, so they would be closer together. Because otherwise, we're talking about having like a straight up pure new API, right? And I want to be careful about that too.
Well, I also don't want to have premature, decision made. So I think it's okay for this API to evolve first, and then we can, adjust later.
Okay.
I don't know what's your desire for the compatibility. I think it's pretty hard to make sure the first version of API is the right one, anyways.
Yeah, no, that's true. Well, let's just flag the fact that we would like to adopt or align with OTel semantics and syntax for the metadata portion of the API, or at least go through that process, right? So it looks the same. Ben, to answer your question, right, I think it's not for collectors, not OTel collectors. It's for other agents that participate in the data path that are not necessarily ztunnel to be able to do this, right? Because they're going to need to fetch metadata about their peers so that then OTel can collect the stats that they emit. Right, and so they need an API to do that, right? It's the reverse DNS lookup with metadata.
I get that. I just don't know what those things would be that would need to do that would not be ztunnel.
gRPC.
Okay.
And other implementation of Ambient, which are not ztunnel, because Ambient is a protocol that can be implemented by others.
Yeah, I mean, the other one is Envoy right now, right? In theory.
That's true.
But I think right now we would have a very hard time trying to get Envoy to adapt to this, and would be better off using baggage with Envoy. Is that fair?
Actually, we already have a workload discovery in Envoy. It's not that hard to add your own. It's just it's just an Istio only, though. That's the problem.
Yeah.
And
okay.
I suspect with a bit of WASM can be put in anywhere where WASM is supported, which is another set of. I mean, at least if we expose it also as a plain gRPC, because gRPC is exposed.
Okay. I think we know what to do, right? I mean, as Quat said, we don't want to prematurely align with the standard that doesn't exist. So let's stick with our one API, but let's try and bring it into alignment with the conventions of OTel if we can, and just put some documentation on the API talking about how this might be used for other use cases. And then we can have a broader conversation with the community and see how that discussion evolves. And everybody may come back and say, we only care about DNS SRV records. And we're like, okay, well, let's use this. Mechanism. Headers or certs. I agree with Costin. The other option of an in-tunnel API is going to be very hard to standardize. Right, it's like doing ALPN. We can do it for ztunnel and ztunnel only, and maybe we could do it for Envoy, but that's going to be painful. So it seems like baggage or cert are the two most viable options. The nice thing about certs, or the lack of baggage in certs, is it's a very clear signaling mechanism to send or not send baggage in headers, right? But we have that asymmetry problem still. What, do you think you could have a little time to look at what our options are for putting extended metadata into the certificate?
Costin already looked at it. It's difficult because there's no fields. So yeah, there's no agreement on what fields to use, and those are all vendor specific. Google reserved a field name for pod name, but that's just Google.
That's a bit, there are different specs, different lists of names and different levels of stability. I mean, tracing is super well defined and stable. There are specs for a lot of things with different level of implementation, of adoptions. That's really the problem.
Are you talking about like standardized ASN1 names for each of the things that we would want to exchange?
Open telemetry, yeah, standardized names for all the things that should be exchanged, yes.
Yes,
As valid ASN1 names?
Oh no, not ASN names, definitely not. Someone was looking at to propose some ASN names, but yeah, sorry, I was thinking that the names defined in OpenTelemetry as keywords and what should be collected, not down to the certificate.
Yeah, no. I want to think about what we would do in the certificate.
well, the certificate names are all hierarchical, and there's no, to make it canonical, you have to basically make an RFC.
Yes.
You cannot just claim it, and the only ones who can claim all vendor specific.
That's not true, actually. There are some open-ended ones.
Yes, we need an organization, basically. I don't know if CNCF owns some organization or OID name for ASN, but Google at least is using its own Google vendor to add the pod name and other things. So it's either a vendor donates an OID or we have an organization with OID. But that's RFC territory. It's probably RFC territory, not.
I think there are ways to do it without requiring an OID. All right, so we need to dig into this offline. How about that?
Yes.
But if we can find a way to do it, we don't necessarily have to standardize it, right?
If we don't standardize it, it's probably not very valuable because we want other to adopt it and to other certificate providers because it's not when you Istio providing certificates for Istio workloads or Citadel.
Well, we can adopt something and propose it as a standard in parallel.
Yeah, that's reasonable.
Well, it also has like a system effect because most of client libraries for TLS don't parse OIDs. So
right, all they parse it's CNs and SANs, right? Like,
yeah, so it's a bit of challenge to actually make it work.
Well, I don't think that's necessarily a problem for us.
Well, boring as it's hiding it, and like a lot of clients because of a lot of wiring to expose extra stuff.
I thought all the reasonable cert libraries would expose all of the ASN1 names items in the cert and their values. They don't process them, they don't interpret them, right? That's the thing that would be dangerous from a security perspective, right?
Yeah, the basic libraries do, but all the wrappers around them, like all of them have, right? They don't.
Yeah, but which ones do we care about and where?
Well, I imagine we have some wraparound in the Rust, so that probably needs to be updated, and one in Envoy needs to be updated, and possibly gRPC one.
Well, let's look. Because if we can make that work, right, that's clearly better. Like, does anybody think that that's not better?
I think I agree. It's just it's a consistent challenge because it requires every component of TLS infrastructure to take advantage of it, and that's a lot. And CAs also need to start testing it.
For the moment, we just need Z tunnels and maybe not even envoys.
And we'll
Right.
need some buy-in, otherwise we're again inventing a new, proprietary header just in TLS.
We can also use a JOT. I mean, sending a JOT for every connection is not such a huge challenge, especially if it's signed.
Right, but the problem with Kotlin is either it's exchanged, right, or it becomes an internal API, or it's a header on connect and connect verbs, right? Those are the only three ways that we have to do something.
Yeah, I know.
Right, so we already said, like, we have to support connect for interop, right? Which means that's basically send baggage, right?
Yes, connect is typically used a JOT. I mean, almost either JOT or basic authentication or some form of
Sure, right. But JOT is a signed bag of attributes, right? That's all it is, with some well-known names and other stuff that people don't care about.
Yeah.
The only other option, right, and that incurred the performance overhead that people were maybe concerned about. If we can't put it in the handshake, the only other place is to put it as an internal API, and we know that's the thing that will interrupt the least, right? Because you'd have to persuade Envoy to implement this, exchange metadata endpoint inside the tunnel, right? A post method, right, that had some well-known semantics. And that's the thing that's the least standard, right? So we'll interrupt the worst.
Yeah, I agree. Maybe we should also look back to the federation ideas, where we standardize some way to federate the reverse lookup, like the proper PTR in DNS. That will also solve the problem. I mean, and it's also valuable for a lot of other things to if we want to go into federation, split brains, and other things.
But obviously, a federation implies an API, right?
Oh yeah, no, but there are some APIs, WebFinger, the PTRDS. There are some APIs that exist. I know. We build a social network in the end, but if we start with web, but the standards are not bad. The standards are not bad.
No, I mean, WebFinger is for publicly published information, right? It doesn't deal with split horizon at all.
Yeah,
so that doesn't work.
I know. XDS with something. I mean, we have some options to define, and it's useful for other purposes to be able to have some sort of control plane level or discovery level federation. It's an alternative to this method.
Like we have that, but right, and so we can define the scope in which that will work, but we also can define situations in which it won't, right, where we have asymmetric knowledge of endpoints and their metadata, and that's going to force us, right? Then you're into like loosely coupled federated systems and like gossip protocols and all that kind of stuff, right? And that's a lot of complexity on top of a situation where we already have a top-down allocator of IDs, right, that works in a federated manner, which is the CA system.
Well,
like somebody mentioned the option the other day of like, I should be able to call the metadata discovery API through the east-west gateway, right? So if I can't look it up locally, I look it up remote, right? Which I would have to do with authentication, and that's an API, right? And that's quite complex.
Yeah, what was discussed with SPIFFE and having, if only SPIFFE was a workload identity, we would have, a fully qualified name in the certificate, and we could use it to look up. But it's a service account, and that's not helping too much.
Okay. So I still suggest we take a harder look at cert offline. We can try capture some of that in the GitHub issue. Right, all Spiffy does is dictate the structure of the SAN that contains the Spiffy ID. It doesn't say whatever else has to go in the cert, right?
Yeah, no, it allows
Lots of other
other
things go.
Yes, absolutely.
Lots of other things go in the cert. Okay, so we have a loosely coupled selection of vaguely satisfactory answers. But the biggest problem seems to be knowing and understanding the control plane visibility boundary to actually be the canonical resolver of metadata. And it's hard to really cleanly define that boundary, in part because we have APIs that make that boundary fuzzy. So we have to work on it. Oh, we filled up the time, despite not having an agenda. Kwok, do you think you can take a look at the cert stuff? I'll try to take a look. And we can see what we can reuse, and we can see where there are gaps, and we can see what existing metadata mechanisms that we can use without necessarily breaking everybody. Right? Because that's the problem with certs, obviously, is there's some parser out there that doesn't like a field and decides to blow. Actually, how about this? Google folks, can you go talk to Adam Langley? Ask him this question.
Yeah, probably we should do that. There was someone else, I think, in JK that was trying to standardize. So maybe I can find him again.
Okay, yeah, that would be helpful just to get some other outside perspectives. Does anybody else have an X509 guru in-house that they can consult with? Yes, I agree, Ben. Everybody hates them, and everybody uses them in different ways. Yeah. It's damned if you do and damned if you don't. I think in the meantime, our only option is to just keep sending it, right? But okay, so if folks have other ideas about baggage exchange, please put them on the GitHub issue. I think there's like 3 or 4 different options already captured there. And we may need to turn that into a doc to get other eyeballs on it to see how the community feels about it. All right. Well, I need to drop everyone. I don't know about anybody else, but thanks for the good discussion.
Thanks a lot.